The Chicano student movement began before March of 1968, but it wasn't until East Los Angeles Chicano students walked out of their decrepit high schools in that month and began to push for changes that the movement really differentiated itself from the previous Mexican-American attempts at achieving equality. These changes were radical to the dominant white Anglo social structure that controlled many aspects of their lives, and the ensuing police repression and brutality only further reinforced a new, radical trend in the students' ideology. A year after the walkouts, in March of 1969, the Crusade for Justice, a civil rights organization, held the National Chicano Youth Liberation Conference at its headquarters in Denver, Colorado. The goal of the conference was to define the growing Chicano movement, its goals, its people, and its ideology. One product of the conference was a document entitled El Plan Espiritual de Aztlán, and it was structured as a call to the Chicano people to unite, fight for change, and bring about a new Chicano reality that resists oppressive Anglo culture. While the overarching claims and ideas expressed were about unity, equality, ending oppression, and working together to create a new identity, the underlying logic in the document largely perpetuated aspects of the dominant Anglo culture it sought to reject. The document uses words like carnalismo and brotherhood, which denote an emphasis on men, thus silencing women. And while some, like George Mariscal, the author of Brown-Eyed Children of the Sun, argued that such words were meant generally and not as a gendered emphasis on Chicano men, the presence of sexism in the movement leadership at the time is undeniable, and Mariscal himself acknowledges that sexism did play a part in the movement. El Plan also called for nationalism as the unifying force and ideology of the Chicano people, insisting that it was the force capable of uniting Chicanos as one. While nationalism is not by definition an unjust system, the Chicano understanding of nationalism was based on European ideas, which Chicanos claimed to reject. It was also tied to patriarchal and oppressive conditions via the history of its implementation in global structures. As some Chicanas developed and refined a consciousness separate of the one espoused by El Plan and the leadership of the movement, there came the call for a separate, though not divisive, ideology that challenged the sexist conditions present in the culture. Chicanas sought to have their own conference in 1971 in Houston, Texas. This conference was meant to be a similar process as the Denver Conference, but rather than creating a sense of unity and belonging as the Denver Conference had, it left many Chicanas feeling conflicted and confused. This was largely in part to the opposition that they faced from the invisible male leadership that largely rejected their calls for a more feminist approach than the current ideology. Certain Chicanas, convinced by their respective male leaders that such women were divisive and sought to destroy el movimiento, followed orders and went to the conference as subversives, with the intent of dismantling the conference from the inside. On the final day of the conference, a walkout was staged that disrupted the conference and only fueled the discontent and frustration that had been brought about by days of infighting, contradicting, and toe-stepping. While it's uncertain that the conference would have been considered a success had the male leadership from Denver and the Brown Berets supported Chicana philosophy, it can be said that they actively worked to challenge the Chicana right to define themselves. However, as the leadership and the legacy of the movement transformed, Chicanas were able to redefine the greater Chicano philosophy, and they also developed their own separate spaces for self-definition. While initial male leadership certainly played its role in limiting the potential of a Chicana philosophy, the movement also created spaces for Chicanas and Chicanos to define themselves through their history, and in part those spaces and mentality of self-definition facilitated subsequent attempts to define Chicanas and the Chicano movement in general.